Welcome to the War Archive, where wars become stories. As the sun rose on June 22, 1944, the men of the German Ninth Corps prepared for what they believed would be another uneventful day. It was the third anniversary of Operation Barbarossa, but there was little sense of symbolism in the trenches of central Belarus. Between them and the Soviet lines stretched a vast minefield, layered defenses, and the reassuring belief that the enemy's attention was fixed far to the south. Here, in this sector of the front, there was nothing to fear. German commanders had grown accustomed to this calm. For months, the central sector of the Eastern Front had been quiet, almost deceptive in its stillness. The real danger, everyone believed, lay elsewhere, where Soviet forces appeared to be massing in Ukraine, threatening the Balkans and the vital oil fields that sustained Germany's war machine. Compared to that looming crisis, Belarus felt like a backwater. What the Germans did not know was that the calm itself was the warning. South of the Ninth Corps, Soviet forces had been moving in full view, columns of tanks, artillery, and infantry shifting conspicuously toward the southern front. German intelligence watched these movements closely and drew the conclusion that seemed obvious. Reinforcements were rushed south. Reserves were stripped from other sectors. Army Group Center, holding the Belarusian front, was left increasingly hollow, its strength spread thin across a wide, static line. But the buildup in the south was a deception, a carefully constructed illusion designed not merely to mislead, but to reassure. The Red Army wanted the Germans to feel safe here, to believe that minefields, trenches, and routine patrols were enough. While German soldiers waited behind their defenses, Soviet engineers studied those minefields. Soviet planners memorized the terrain, and entire armies assembled just beyond the horizon, unseen and unchallenged. This was not a local offensive. It was something far larger. In the weeks leading up to June 22nd, the Soviet Union had prepared the most powerful concentration of force it had ever unleashed in a single operation. More than 1 million men stood ready. Thousands of guns were pre-registered on German positions. Tanks were modified for a role they had never played before. Aircraft filled forward airfields, waiting for the moment when surprise would matter more than numbers. For the men of Army Group Center, the danger was not that they were weak. It was that they were confident. Their defenses were strong. Their orders were clear. And their expectations were catastrophically wrong. Operation Bagration, the most devastating military defeat in all of German history, was about to begin. Not with a warning, but with silence breaking into thunder. 3 years earlier, the German army had crossed into the Soviet Union with a confidence bordering on arrogance. In June 1941, Operation Barbarossa unleashed the largest invasion in human history, and in its opening months, it appeared unstoppable. Entire Soviet armies were encircled and destroyed. Cities fell in rapid succession. Millions of Red Army soldiers were killed or captured, and to many observers, it seemed only a matter of time before Moscow itself would collapse. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. It absorbed the blow, staggered, and adapted. The first cracks in Germany's vision of total victory appeared in the winter of 1941, when the advance on Moscow stalled in the snow and cold. German troops, exhausted and undersupplied, found themselves fighting an enemy that was learning faster than expected. Soviet commanders began to reorganize shattered units, relocate industry eastward, and rebuild their armies on a scale Germany could not match. By 1942, the war in the East had become something far different from the lightning campaign Berlin had envisioned. The Wehrmacht still struck hard, but it no longer struck decisively. The following year would prove catastrophic. At Stalingrad in February 1943, an entire German army was encircled and destroyed, marking the first time the myth of German invincibility shattered beyond repair. Months later, at Kursk, Germany's last major offensive in the east was halted and beaten back. From that point forward, the initiative belonged to the Red Army. The Soviet counteroffensives that followed Kursk were relentless. German forces were driven back more than 800 kilometers, over 500 miles, in a grinding retreat that bled men, tanks, and morale. By February 1944, the front finally stabilized, but it did so at a terrible cost to Germany. The Wehrmacht had lost its strategic freedom. Where it once chose when and where to attack, it now reacted, patching holes, shifting reserves, and hoping to slow an enemy that was growing stronger with every month. Of the three German army groups holding the Eastern Front, Army Group South suffered the worst. Defeated repeatedly, it was pushed far back into Ukraine, creating a dangerous bulge in the German line. To German strategists, this bulge looked like an open wound, one the Soviets would surely exploit. Logic suggested the next major Soviet blow would fall there, driving toward the Balkans, threatening vital oil supplies, and opening a path into southern Poland. Army Group Center, by contrast, appeared relatively stable. Its front in Belarus had moved little in months. Defensive lines were established, minefields were laid, trench systems stretched across forests and marshes. Compared to the chaos in the south, this sector felt almost secure. That sense of security would prove fatal. What the Germans did not grasp was that stability itself had become a liability. While Army Group South absorbed attention, reinforcements, and planning, Army Group Center remained fixed in place, large, exposed, and dangerously dependent on static defenses. The Red Army, watching patiently from the other side, understood that this was where the war could be broken open completely. Germany had gone from the aggressor of 1941 to a force struggling to hold ground in 1944, and soon it would be forced not merely to retreat, but to collapse. By the spring of 1944, German strategy on the Eastern Front was shaped less by confidence than by fear. The question was no longer whether the Red Army would attack again, but where the next blow would fall, and how devastating it would be. To most German planners, the answer seemed obvious. The southern sector of the front dominated their thinking. Army Group South had been battered relentlessly since Kursk, pushed back through Ukraine in a series of costly retreats. The region held prizes Germany could not afford to lose: access routes into Central Europe, the industrial regions of southern Poland, and beyond them, the oil fields of Romania. Without that oil, the German war machine would grind to a halt. Every instinct told Berlin that the Soviets would strike there next. German intelligence appeared to confirm this assumption. Reports spoke of Soviet troop movements in Ukraine, of new formations assembling near the Lviv-Sandomierz area. Rail traffic increased, bridges were reinforced, supply depots expanded. All the signs pointed south. To German commanders, it looked like the prelude to a decisive push aimed straight at the heart of what remained of Germany's strategic depth. As a result, resources flowed southward. Nearly the entire operational reserve of the Eastern Front was shifted to bolster Army Group South. Armored divisions, artillery units, and mobile reserves were redeployed in anticipation of a massive Soviet thrust. Even as the front stretched thin elsewhere, the South was reinforced again and again, becoming the focal point of German defensive planning. Belarus, meanwhile, was judged differently. The terrain was hostile: dense forests, swamps, and poor roads that limited rapid movement. Large-scale operations there were assumed to be difficult, slow, and vulnerable to counterattack. Army Group Center, though large, appeared well entrenched and protected by natural obstacles. Its position seemed solid enough to withstand anything short of a sustained siege. This assumption shaped every decision that followed. Requests from Army Group Center for reinforcements were delayed or denied. Its units were expected to hold their ground with what they had. High Command believed that even if the Soviets attacked in Belarus, it would be a secondary effort, a diversion at most, meant to pin German forces while the real offensive broke through in the south. The logic was not unreasonable. It was just wrong. What German planners failed to understand was that the Red Army had changed. The Soviets were no longer content with attritional battles or frontal assaults against strongpoints. They were planning something far more ambitious, an operation designed to shatter an entire army group in one stroke, using surprise, overwhelming force, and depth of penetration rather than gradual pressure. By expecting the wrong attack, Germany had already lost the first phase of the battle. Army Group Center sat exposed, confident in defenses that would soon be tested in ways they were never meant to endure. The trap was set, not through German incompetence, but through assumptions that felt logical, familiar, and fatally comfortable. While German planners fixated on the South, Soviet commanders were thinking in terms of collapse, not pressure. To them, Ukraine was tempting, but dangerous. A southern offensive invited flank attacks, offered German armor room to maneuver, and risked trading territory for time. Belarus, by contrast, offered something far more decisive. It was the keystone of the German front. If Army Group Center could be destroyed, the entire German position in the east would unravel at once. Army Group Center was the largest of the German formations on the Eastern Front. It held the central corridor between Army Group North and South, anchoring the line from the Baltic to the Carpathians. Its rail hubs, Vitebsk, Orsha, Mogilev, Bobruisk, and Minsk, were the arteries through which men, fuel, and ammunition flowed. Break those arteries, and the German front would bleed out. From the Soviet perspective, Belarus was also safer ground for a decisive blow. The Germans had stripped it of mobile reserves. Their divisions were static, dug into trenches and minefields, trained to hold ground rather than maneuver. The forests and marshes that German planners believed would slow an attacker would instead trap defenders once breakthroughs were achieved. Encirclement, not penetration alone, was the objective. This thinking reflected how far the Red Army had evolved since 1941. Early in the war, Soviet offensives had often been blunt and costly, trading lives for ground. By 1944, Soviet operational art had matured. Commanders planned not just to breach a front, but to exploit it immediately, to push deep into the enemy rear, sever communications, and force entire armies into pockets where resistance became meaningless. Operation Bagration was built around this concept. It was not one attack, but several synchronized blows delivered across a wide front. Northern and southern pincers would close around key cities. Armored spearheads would follow infantry breakthroughs within hours, not days. Air power would isolate the battlefield, while partisans would sabotage railways and bridges behind German lines, preventing reinforcement or retreat. The goal was not Minsk alone, nor Vitebsk or Bobruisk by themselves. The goal was annihilation. Soviet planners believed that if Army Group Center was destroyed, Germany would lose not just territory, but the ability to hold the Eastern Front as a coherent force. The Germans, convinced that Belarus was a secondary theater, never saw this logic clearly. Their defenses were strong, but they were designed to absorb blows, not to survive being cut off, bypassed, and surrounded. When the Soviet offensive came, it would not come as a probing attack or a gradual push. It would come as a flood, aimed squarely at the heart of the German front, where the Germans felt safest of all. To break Army Group Center, the Red Army needed more than strength. It needed surprise. And surprise, on a front watched obsessively by German intelligence, could only be achieved through deception on an industrial scale. The Soviets had a word for it: maskirovka. It meant camouflage, concealment, misdirection, but in practice it was the deliberate shaping of the enemy's expectations. In early 1944, the Soviets launched one of the most sophisticated deception campaigns of the war. Entire formations were moved openly toward the southern front in Ukraine. Tanks rumbled along visible roads. Supply depots appeared where German reconnaissance aircraft could easily spot them. Radio traffic increased in sectors the Germans already feared. Everything about the movement said the same thing: this is where the attack will come. At the same time, Belarus was made to look empty. Units there appeared to withdraw. Vehicles were driven away during daylight hours, only to return under cover of darkness, camouflaged and dispersed. Camps were hidden in forests. Bridges were repaired quietly. Roads were reinforced without fanfare. To German observers, the region seemed stagnant, defensive, almost neglected. The deception was layered carefully. Soviet radio operators transmitted false signals mimicking troop redeployments. Dummy installations were constructed to draw attention away from real concentrations of force. Even artillery was repositioned to create the illusion of weakness where strength was actually accumulating. German intelligence officers, seeing what they expected to see, reported exactly what Soviet planners wanted them to believe. What made the deception so convincing was that it contained truth. A real Soviet offensive was indeed being prepared in the south, aimed through Ukraine into southern Poland. This genuine operation reinforced every false signal pointing in that direction. German analysts, confident in their assessments, felt no reason to question the broader picture. The lie worked because it aligned perfectly with German fears. By the time June approached, the deception had achieved its purpose. German reserves were locked into the southern sector. Requests for reinforcement from Army Group Center were brushed aside. Belarus remained a secondary concern, quiet, fortified, and assumed to be safe. In reality, it was anything but. Behind the forests and marshes of Belarus, entire Soviet fronts stood ready. Infantry divisions waited silently. Tank armies prepared to surge forward the moment a breach appeared. Artillery crews had already registered their guns on German positions, down to individual strongpoints. The battlefield was mapped, measured, and rehearsed in detail. Maskirovka did not hide the Soviet army. It hid Soviet intent. And when the moment came, that difference would cost Germany not kilometers of ground, but an entire army group. The most dangerous deceptions are never built on falsehood alone. They succeed because they contain just enough truth to feel undeniable. In the spring of 1944, Soviet planners understood this principle perfectly and used it to devastating effect. Even as preparations for Operation Bagration accelerated in Belarus, the Red Army was genuinely planning a major offensive in the south. In Ukraine, forces were assembling for a push toward the Lviv-Sandomierz region of southern Poland. Rail lines carried real troops. Supplies flowed in enormous quantities. Commanders drafted real operational orders. This was not theater. It was war planning in earnest. For German intelligence, this confirmed everything they already believed. Reports from reconnaissance aircraft, intercepted radio traffic, and human sources all pointed in the same direction. The Soviets were preparing a decisive southern strike. The Balkans, the oil fields, the gateway into Central Europe, these were the prizes Germany assumed Stalin wanted most. And in this case, Germany was not entirely wrong. What German commanders failed to grasp was that the Soviet Union no longer thought in terms of a single main effort. The Red Army of 1944 was capable of planning and executing multiple large-scale operations simultaneously. What had once been a limitation of Soviet command and logistics had become a strength. The southern offensive was real, but it was not the main blow. It was the supporting truth that made the greater deception believable. This overlap paralyzed German decision-making. To shift reserves back toward Belarus would risk leaving the south exposed to a very real threat. To hold them in place seemed prudent, even responsible. Every rational calculation reinforced the same conclusion. Army Group Center could hold, at least long enough for reinforcements to arrive if needed. Meanwhile, Soviet planners exploited this hesitation ruthlessly. Timetables were synchronized so that no single German sector could be reinforced without weakening another. Even if Berlin recognized the danger at the last moment, it would already be too late. Trains could not move faster than the Red Army advanced. By early June, German high command was confident, wrongly so. Their assessments were neat, logical, and disastrously incomplete. They believed they understood the battlefield. In reality, they were reacting to a picture the Soviets themselves had painted for them. The truth had sold the lie. And once Germany committed fully to defending the wrong place, the outcome of Operation Bagration was no longer a question of possibility, but of timing. By mid-June 1944, the scale of what the Soviet Union had assembled behind the forests and marshes of Belarus was almost beyond comprehension. Operation Bagration was not simply another offensive, it was the full expression of the Red Army's recovery, expansion, and transformation after 3 years of brutal war. More than 1.6 million Soviet soldiers were assigned to the operation, organized across multiple fronts with tightly coordinated objectives. Supporting them were over 32,000 artillery pieces, an unprecedented concentration of firepower. Nearly 5,800 tanks and self-propelled guns waited in concealed assembly areas, while some 7,800 aircraft filled forward airfields, ready to isolate the battlefield from the first hours of the attack. This was not brute force alone. It was force arranged with precision. Artillery units were positioned to deliver overwhelming barrages at exact points along the German line. Tank formations were grouped not to batter defenses head-on, but to exploit breaches the moment they appeared. Infantry divisions trained specifically for breakthrough operations, rehearsing assaults on trench systems and fortified strongpoints until movements became instinctive. Behind the front lines, another army was already at work. Soviet partisans in Belarus, joined in places by elements of the Polish resistance, launched a coordinated campaign of sabotage. Rail lines were blown up repeatedly. Bridges collapsed under explosives. Communications were severed. German supply movements slowed, then faltered entirely. Even before the first Soviet shell fell, Army Group Center was being strangled from behind. In contrast, the German defenders faced the coming storm with far fewer resources. Army Group Center fielded roughly half the manpower of the attacking Soviet forces. Its armored strength was a fraction of what stood opposite it, and its air support was negligible. What it lacked in numbers, it hoped to compensate for with defensive preparation. Trench systems stretched across the front. Fortified villages were turned into strong points. Minefields, dense and extensive, covered approaches that German commanders believed would slow any attack long enough for reserves to react. The assumption was that static defenses, carefully layered and deeply constructed, could absorb even a powerful blow. What German planners failed to appreciate was how completely the Red Army intended to overwhelm those defenses. The Soviets were not preparing to grind forward inch by inch. They were preparing to break the line open in multiple places at once, then pour through faster than German command and logistics could respond. The weight of the Red Army was not simply in its numbers, it was in its confidence. For the first time in the war, Soviet commanders believed, not hoped, but believed, that they were about to destroy an entire German army group, and they had built the force to do exactly that. Army Group Center faced the coming summer with a quiet confidence born of preparation. Across the forests and marshes of Belarus, German engineers had transformed the landscape into a defensive maze. Trenches zigzagged through the earth in layered belts. Dugouts and bunkers were reinforced with timber and concrete. Entire villages were converted into strong points, their buildings linked by firing positions and covered approaches. Most formidable of all were the minefields. Laid in dense belts along likely avenues of advance, they were meant to slow any attacker, channel movement, and buy time for counterattacks. Anti-personnel mines blanketed the approaches to German lines, while anti-tank mines lay buried in carefully calculated patterns. To the men defending them, these fields were reassurance made tangible. Mines did not panic. Mines did not retreat. German doctrine reinforced this sense of security. The defensive system was designed to absorb an attack, bleed the enemy, and then stabilize. Holding ground mattered more than maneuver. Orders from high command emphasized firmness. Positions were to be defended, not abandoned. Requests to pull back or redeploy were routinely denied. In Berlin, every kilometer surrendered felt like another step toward defeat. But these defenses carried an unspoken assumption that the front would be tested gradually, that an enemy would probe, push, pause, and push again. They were not designed to withstand simultaneous breakthroughs across a wide front, followed by rapid exploitation deep into the rear. They were shields meant to stop a hammer, not to survive a flood. Worse still, the very terrain the Germans trusted would work against them once the line was broken. Forests limited visibility, marshes restricted movement. Poor roads funneled retreating units into narrow corridors. Static defenses offered protection only as long as they were connected to neighboring units. Once isolated, they became traps. German commanders believed they could compensate for shortages in men, tanks, and aircraft through discipline and fortification. And under different circumstances, they might have been right. But against an enemy that planned not merely to penetrate the line, but to erase it, such defenses were brittle beneath their strength. As June approached its third week, the front remained quiet. Patrols reported nothing unusual. Minefields lay undisturbed. Artillery crews waited by their guns. The Germans had built their shields carefully, and they trusted them completely. They did not realize that Soviet engineers had already rehearsed how to tear those shields apart. At dawn, on June 22nd, 1944, exactly 3 years after German forces had crossed into the Soviet Union, the silence along the Belarusian front shattered. Without warning, the Red Army unleashed a bombardment of unprecedented intensity. Artillery fire rolled across German positions in waves, hammering trenches, strong points, and gun batteries that had been carefully prepared for months. For the defenders, it felt less like an attack and more like the earth itself turning against them. The opening blow fell hardest in the north, around the city of Vitebsk. Soviet infantry surged forward under the cover of the barrage, advancing in coordinated formations designed to overwhelm German positions before defenders could recover from the shock. Almost immediately, Soviet air power joined the assault, striking German artillery emplacements and rear areas, blinding command posts and severing communications. Vitebsk had long been considered a bastion, an anchor point that secured the northern flank of Army Group Center. German commanders believed it could withstand prolonged assault. What they did not anticipate was the speed at which the Soviet pincers closed. Soviet forces pushed south and north of the city simultaneously, bypassing resistance where possible and isolating strongpoints rather than destroying them outright. Within hours, German defensive cohesion began to unravel. Units fought bravely, but the scale of the assault overwhelmed local command. Messages sent to higher headquarters went unanswered or arrived too late to matter. Requests to withdraw were denied, as German doctrine demanded that positions be held at all costs. By the end of the first day, the outlines of encirclement were already visible. Soviet troops had driven wedges deep into the German line, cutting roads and threatening supply routes. What had been intended as a firm defensive perimeter around Vitebsk was rapidly turning into a cage. For the men trapped inside, the realization came slowly, and then all at once. This was not a probing attack. This was not a diversion. This was the main effort, and it was aimed directly at the heart of Army Group Center. As night fell on June 22nd, the storm did not subside. Artillery continued to fire. Soviet infantry pressed forward relentlessly, and around Vitebsk, the first great pocket of Operation Bagration began to close. As the infantry assaults ground forward around Vitebsk, the second phase of the Soviet plan came into motion with brutal efficiency. At dawn on June 23rd, the ground itself seemed to shift as armored formations surged toward the breach points. Leading the advance were columns of T-34 tanks, many of them modified in a way the German defenders had never seen before. Mounted to their fronts were massive metal rollers, crude in appearance but devastating in effect. These mine-clearing devices crushed anti-tank mines beneath their weight, detonating them safely ahead of following vehicles. Where German engineers had spent months laying defensive belts designed to halt any armored advance, the Red Army punched corridors through them in minutes. Behind the rollers came waves of infantry and additional armor. The movement was fluid, relentless, and synchronized. This was not improvisation, it was doctrine. Soviet commanders were applying deep battle theory as it had been envisioned decades earlier: breakthrough, exploitation, and collapse of the enemy's entire operational system. The goal was not to win a firefight at the front, but to render the front meaningless. German strong points that resisted were bypassed. Units that held their ground found themselves isolated within hours, their supply routes cut, their communications severed. The minefields that had promised safety now boxed them in, preventing movement and escape. Static defense became a liability, not a strength. Armored spearheads drove past shattered trench lines and into the German rear, striking headquarters, artillery parks, and transport columns. Roads once used for reinforcement became avenues of retreat or death. German commanders struggled to understand the scale of what was happening. Reports spoke of Soviet tanks far behind the front lines, appearing where no enemy should have been able to reach so quickly. This was the essence of Soviet operational art in 1944. Rather than grinding down resistance position by position, the Red Army shattered cohesion, forcing the German defense to collapse under its own rigidity. The speed of the advance mattered as much as its power. Every hour gained meant another German unit cut off, another pocket forming. By the evening of June 23rd, the fate of Vitebsk was no longer in doubt. Soviet forces had torn open the minefields, surged through the gaps, and sealed the exits. The city, and the German 53rd Corps within it, was now surrounded. What followed would be one of the most complete destructions of a German corps in the entire war. Inside Vitebsk, the situation deteriorated with terrifying speed. The German 53rd Corps, now completely encircled, waited for orders that never came. Communications with higher headquarters were intermittent at best, and when messages did get through, the response was always the same: hold the city. No withdrawal, no breakout, no flexibility. German commanders on the ground understood what that meant. The city was no longer a defensive anchor. It was a pocket. Soviet forces controlled the roads, the rail lines, and the approaches in every direction. Ammunition stocks dwindled. Artillery positions were systematically destroyed by airstrikes and counter-battery fire. Each hour tightened the noose. Repeated requests to evacuate were sent up the chain of command. Each was denied. Adolf Hitler had declared Vitebsk a Festerplatz, a fortified place to be held at all costs. In theory, such strong points were meant to delay the enemy and buy time for countermeasures. In practice, they became mass graves. By June 25th, Soviet units had completed the encirclement. Infantry pressed inward from all sides, while tanks sealed off any remaining escape routes. German attempts to break out were piecemeal and poorly coordinated, launched by units already weakened by days of bombardment and isolation. None succeeded. 2 days later, on June 27th, the final assault began. Soviet forces stormed the city street by street, crushing resistance wherever it appeared. Some German units fought to the last round. Others surrendered when it became clear there was no relief coming. By the end of the fighting, Vitebsk had fallen completely. The destruction was total. Nearly 30,000 German soldiers from the 53rd Corps were killed or taken prisoner. An entire corps had ceased to exist in less than a week. For the Red Army, it was a stunning validation of their operational plan. For Army Group Center, it was the first unmistakable sign that something far worse was unfolding. The fall of Vitebsk was not an isolated disaster. It was the opening rupture in a front that was about to split apart entirely. Even as the city burned, Soviet pincers elsewhere were closing with equal speed and equal force. The collapse had begun. While Vitebsk was being crushed in the north, an equally decisive blow was unfolding in the south. On June 23rd, the Red Army launched the second arm of its great encirclement, targeting Bobruisk and Mogilev, cities that anchored the southern half of Army Group Center and controlled the roads leading toward Minsk. If these positions fell, the German defense would lose any chance of an organized withdrawal. The southern pincer aimed at Bobruisk was commanded by Konstantin Rokossovsky, one of the most capable and most independent commanders in the Red Army. His role in Operation Bagration was not merely operational, but symbolic of how far Soviet command culture had evolved since the disasters of 1941. In the weeks before the offensive, Rokossovsky had stood before Stalin and proposed an unorthodox plan: 2 main breakthrough axes instead of 1. Stalin rejected the idea and ordered him outside to reconsider. Rokossovsky returned with the same answer. Stalin sent him out again. Rokossovsky returned once more, unwavering. At last, Stalin placed a hand on his shoulder and said quietly, "Your confidence is the guarantee of victory." That moment mattered. It showed a Red Army transformed, where commanders were no longer punished for independent thought, and where political authority had learned painfully to listen to military reality. The double thrust Rokossovsky demanded would soon justify that trust in blood and steel. When the attack began, the results were immediate. German defenses south of Bobruisk proved alarmingly brittle. The German Ninth Army attempted to redeploy its armored reserves to block the Soviet advance, but the terrain betrayed them. Marshy ground swallowed vehicles, mechanical failures mounted, and entire columns stalled before reaching the front. What should have been a coordinated countermeasure dissolved into chaos. Rokossovsky's forces surged forward far faster than even Soviet planners had anticipated. Gaps opened where no gaps should have existed. German units were bypassed, isolated, and rendered irrelevant in a matter of hours. The southern pincer drove deep, tearing open the flank of Army Group Center. At the same time, a parallel offensive targeted Mogilev. Here, the objective was fixation rather than speed. Soviet forces aimed to pin the German Fourth Army in place, dominate the road network, and prevent any organized retreat toward Minsk. Artillery pulverized German positions, while infantry pressed forward relentlessly, trading casualties for momentum and never allowing the defense to stabilize. By June 28th, Mogilev fell. The Fourth Army, battered and increasingly cut off, could no longer maneuver. A day later, Bobruisk was captured as well. Large portions of both the Fourth and Ninth Armies were destroyed or taken prisoner. Attempts at breakout were shattered by artillery and airstrikes before they could gain momentum. In less than a week, the southern half of Army Group Center had ceased to exist as a coherent force. Over 100,000 German soldiers were lost, killed, wounded, or captured. The double pincer Rokossovsky had fought to preserve had worked exactly as intended. The road to Minsk now lay open, and with it, the fate of Army Group Center was sealed. By the final days of June, the German front in Belarus no longer resembled a defensive line. It was a series of disconnected fragments, each fighting in isolation, each unaware of how completely the situation had already slipped beyond control. The speed of the Soviet advance had shattered not just units, but understanding itself. German commanders no longer asked how to stop the attack, but where the front even was. The fall of Mogilev on June 28th marked a critical turning point. The city had anchored the German Fourth Army's position along the Dnieper, controlling roads and supply routes essential for any organized withdrawal. Once it was lost, the Fourth Army's defensive posture collapsed. Units that had been ordered to hold their positions found themselves bypassed, cut off, and rendered strategically irrelevant. The next day, June 29th, Bobruisk fell in the south. Here the destruction was even more complete. Large elements of the German Ninth Army were trapped as Soviet forces closed in from multiple directions. Attempts to break out were poorly coordinated and immediately crushed by artillery and airstrikes. Thousands were killed in the effort. Thousands more surrendered when ammunition ran out and hope followed. Within 48 hours, 2 major cities were lost, and 2 German field armies effectively ceased to function as coherent fighting forces. The scale of the disaster was staggering. What German planners had expected to be a delaying action had turned into annihilation. Entire divisions vanished from the order of battle almost overnight. Soviet forces did not pause to consolidate. They pressed forward relentlessly, exploiting the vacuum left behind. Armored spearheads surged westward, bypassing shattered German units and driving deep into the operational rear. Supply depots fell intact. Headquarters were overrun before they could relocate. German attempts to establish new defensive lines collapsed before they could be formed. By the end of June, more than 100,000 German soldiers had been lost in the central sector alone. The Red Army's initial objectives had been achieved ahead of schedule, and the offensive was only gaining momentum. The front line in Belarus had not merely been breached, it had been erased. And with nothing substantial left between the Soviets and Minsk, the final act of Operation Bagration was about to begin. As June drew to a close, the focus of Operation Bagration narrowed to a single objective: Minsk. The Belarusian capital was more than a city. It was the nerve center of Army Group Center, the hub through which roads and rail lines converged. If Minsk fell, any remaining coherence in the German defense would vanish with it. For the Germans, the situation was already desperate. Reports arriving at headquarters were fragmented and often contradictory. Entire formations had gone silent. Others were retreating without orders, simply trying to escape the advancing Soviet tide. What remained of the Fourth and Ninth Armies was falling back toward Minsk in disarray, pursued relentlessly by Soviet armor and harried constantly from the air. In Berlin, the scale of the disaster could no longer be ignored. Field Marshal Ernst Busch, commander of Army Group Center, was abruptly dismissed and replaced by Walter Model, known as Hitler's fireman, a specialist in emergency defense. Model arrived to find a front already in ruins. The Ninth Army was shattered in the south. The Fourth Army, east of Minsk, was in grave danger of encirclement. There were no intact reserves left to stabilize the line. Model acted quickly. He ordered what forces remained to withdraw toward Minsk and attempted to scrape together a defensive screen around the city. Units were pulled from Army Group North and South and rushed toward the crisis. Bomber and armored formations were redeployed in a desperate effort to slow the Soviet advance. But by now, the Red Army controlled the skies. Reinforcements moved by day were annihilated from above. Those that moved by night arrived late, exhausted, and under strength. One formation did manage to reach Minsk in time. The 5th Panzer Division arrived on June 27th and was immediately committed to holding key road junctions northeast of the city. Its heavy Tiger tanks proved formidable, tearing into Soviet armored columns and inflicting severe losses. For a brief moment, it appeared that the German defense might yet stabilize, but the cost was ruinous. The Tigers, powerful as they were, could not be replaced. Constant fighting, mechanical breakdowns, and relentless Soviet pressure wore the division down with terrifying speed. Within 2 days, its strength collapsed, from over 100 heavy tanks to fewer than 20 operational vehicles. The last mobile shield of Minsk was being ground away. As Soviet pincers closed from the north and south, the trap tightened. By the first days of July, more than 100,000 German soldiers were converging on Minsk, some hoping to defend it, others simply trying to pass through. They would find there was no escape. The race for Minsk was nearly over. The race to survive it had already been lost. Walter Model had inherited a disaster already in motion. His reputation as a master of defensive warfare rested on his ability to stabilize collapsing fronts. But in Belarus, the conditions that made such rescues possible no longer existed. The Red Army was not pressing at a single point. It was everywhere at once. And time, the one resource Model needed most, had already run out. His first instinct was retreat. The remnants of the 4th and 9th Armies were ordered to withdraw toward Minsk as quickly as possible, abandoning positions that had been declared unyielding only days earlier. But this withdrawal was not a maneuver. It was an evacuation under fire. Soviet aircraft roamed freely above the roads, turning columns of men and vehicles into targets. Every bridge, crossroads, and forest clearing became a killing ground. Model attempted to build a new defensive line around Minsk using whatever forces could still move. Units from Army Group North and South were stripped and rushed toward the city, but their arrival only added to the chaos. Without air cover, and with communications collapsing, reinforcements were often destroyed before they reached their destinations. Those that arrived found themselves thrown directly into combat without preparation. The heaviest burden fell on the 5th Panzer Division. Its Tiger tanks, some of the most powerful armored vehicles ever fielded, were deployed along the northeastern approaches to Minsk. In direct engagements, they proved devastating. Soviet T-34s burned by the dozen. For a moment, German crews believed they might yet hold long enough to reopen escape routes for the encircled armies. But this was a battle Germany could not afford to fight. Every Tiger lost was irreplaceable. Mechanical failures mounted under constant strain. Fuel shortages worsened. Soviet artillery and aircraft focused relentlessly on the heavy tanks, isolating and wearing them down piece by piece. Within 48 hours, the division's strength had collapsed from more than 150 heavy tanks to fewer than 20 operational vehicles. Model understood the implications immediately. The last mobile reserve capable of influencing the battle was gone. Minsk could no longer be defended in any meaningful sense. What remained was only the question of how many men could still escape before the encirclement closed completely. On July 3rd, the answer became clear. Soviet armored spearheads from the north and south met just outside the city, sealing the ring. Minsk was surrounded. Inside and east of the city, the shattered remains of 2 German field armies, more than 100,000 men, were now trapped with nowhere left to run. The Tiger tanks had fought with ferocity and skill, but steel, no matter how thick, could not stop a flood. The encirclement of Minsk on July 3, 1944, marked the point of no return. Soviet armored spearheads had linked up west of the city, closing the ring with decisive finality. Inside the pocket, confusion reigned. Units from the shattered 4th and 9th Armies crowded roads and forests east of Minsk, cut off from supply, leadership, and hope. What remained of German command struggled to impose order on a force that no longer functioned as an army. The Soviet assault on the city itself began almost immediately. The 2nd Guards Tank Corps punched through the remaining defensive positions in the early hours of July 3rd, exploiting gaps that could no longer be sealed. Resistance inside Minsk was sporadic and disorganized. Some German units attempted to hold intersections and strong buildings, but without coordination or support, such stands were brief. By the following day, Soviet forces had cleared the city of organized German resistance. East of Minsk, the situation was even worse. Tens of thousands of German soldiers found themselves trapped in forests and villages, surrounded by Soviet infantry and armor. Attempts to break out were launched almost daily, driven by desperation rather than strategy. Columns surged forward under cover of darkness, only to be smashed by artillery fire or cut down by Soviet blocking positions. Each failure reduced the pocket further, draining strength and morale. On July 8th, the final attempt collapsed. Lieutenant General Vincenz Müller, acting commander of the German 4th Army, was captured after yet another failed breakout. With no realistic chance of escape and no orders forthcoming from higher command, Müller ordered the remaining forces to surrender. Around 60,000 German soldiers were taken prisoner. The rest, nearly as many, had already been killed in the encirclement. The destruction was unprecedented. Since the beginning of Operation Bagration, some 25 German divisions had been annihilated. Approximately 300,000 men were killed or captured, along with vast quantities of equipment that Germany could no longer replace. Army Group Center, once the backbone of the Eastern Front, had effectively ceased to exist. The road west lay open, and the Red Army did not hesitate. With Minsk fallen and Army Group Center shattered, the German front in the east no longer existed as a continuous line. What followed was not consolidation, but acceleration. Soviet commanders understood that moments like this were rare, and that hesitation could be fatal. The Red Army surged forward, determined to turn operational collapse into irreversible strategic defeat. To the north, a powerful thrust drove toward the Baltic Sea. The objective was clear: sever the last land connection between the remnants of Army Group Center and Army Group North, isolating the latter in the Baltic states. The Soviet First Baltic Front advanced rapidly through Lithuania, encountering only fragmented resistance from German units already hollowed out by weeks of defeat. On July 27th, Soviet forces seized the city of Šiauliai with little opposition. 4 days later, they reached the Gulf of Riga. With that advance, land communications between Army Group Center and Army Group North were cut completely. Hundreds of thousands of German troops were now trapped in the Baltic region, doomed to hold out in isolation for the remainder of the war. Simultaneously, other Soviet armies pushed westward into Poland. Offensives toward Vilnius and Białystok drove German forces out of much of Lithuania and northern Poland, widening the breach and preventing the formation of any new defensive line. Rail hubs fell intact. Supply depots were captured before they could be destroyed. The German rear collapsed faster than Berlin could react. The sheer speed of this advance astonished even Soviet planners. In less than 2 months, the Red Army had surged forward more than 500 kilometers. Tanks alone could not explain it. Behind the armored spearheads rolled endless columns of American-built Studebaker trucks, delivered through the Lend-Lease program. These vehicles carried fuel, ammunition, food, and spare parts, keeping pace with the advance and ensuring that breakthroughs did not stall for lack of supply. They were not glamorous weapons, but they were indispensable. Without hundreds of thousands of such trucks, the theory of deep battle would have outrun its own logistics long before reaching Poland. In a very real sense, they were the invisible legs of the Red Army. To the south, a parallel Soviet offensive drove through Ukraine toward the Balkans. German defenses cracked under the combined pressure, and the political consequences were immediate. Romania and Bulgaria, watching the Eastern Front collapse in real time, abandoned the Axis in a bid to save themselves. Germany's coalition was unraveling as fast as its armies. By mid-July, the scale of the disaster was undeniable. The Red Army had advanced farther, faster, and with greater coordination than at any point in the war. The destruction of Army Group Center had opened a corridor straight into the heart of German-occupied Europe. For the first time, the road to Berlin no longer felt distant, it felt inevitable. As Soviet forces surged westward after the fall of Minsk, hope raced ahead of them. Nowhere was that hope more intense or more tragic than in Warsaw. After 5 years of brutal occupation, the city listened for the sound of approaching artillery and dared to believe that liberation was finally at hand. On August 1, 1944, the Polish Home Army rose in revolt. Between 20 and 50,000 resistance fighters launched a desperate uprising against the German garrison, seizing buildings, blocking streets, and raising flags over shattered neighborhoods. Their goal was clear: free Warsaw before the arrival of the Red Army and reassert Polish sovereignty in the heart of the nation. For a brief moment, it seemed possible. German units were caught off guard. Street fighting raged. Entire districts fell into Polish hands, but the Red Army did not cross the Vistula. From a purely military standpoint, the reasons were real. Operation Bagration had pushed Soviet forces to the limits of their endurance. Supply lines stretched hundreds of kilometers behind the front. Railways needed repair. Ammunition, fuel, and food lagged behind advancing formations. Units were exhausted, and German resistance stiffened as fresh troops and armored formations were rushed in from other theaters, including Italy. But logistics were not the whole story. Politics cast a longer, colder shadow. To Joseph Stalin, the Polish Home Army represented not liberation, but a threat. It was loyal to the Polish government in exile and openly hostile to communist control. A liberated Warsaw under its authority would complicate Soviet plans for post-war Eastern Europe. The uprising did not fit the future Stalin intended to impose. Soviet forces halted on the eastern bank of the Vistula, Requests for assistance went unanswered. Allied aircraft attempting to resupply the insurgents were denied permission to land on Soviet-controlled airfields. Warsaw was left isolated, its fate sealed not by battlefield necessity alone, but by deliberate political calculation. German reinforcements soon arrived. The uprising was crushed with ruthless efficiency. Neighborhoods were leveled, civilians were massacred or deported. By October, Warsaw lay in ruins, its resistance destroyed, its population broken. The city had risen in hope and been left to die in isolation. Operation Bagration itself came to a halt on August 19th. Weather worsened. Supply lines caught up. The Red Army consolidated its gains after one of the greatest victories in military history. In less than 2 months, Soviet forces had advanced over 550 kilometers, liberated all of Belarus, and annihilated Army Group Center. Around 400,000 German soldiers were killed or captured. The Red Army paid a terrible price of its own, roughly 180,000 dead and more than 500,000 wounded or sick. In late July, 57,000 German prisoners captured around Minsk were marched through the streets of Moscow in a carefully staged display, an echo of ancient triumphs meant to show the world that the balance of power had irreversibly shifted. Operation Bagration was a military masterpiece. It shattered Germany's strategic position in the east and ensured that the Wehrmacht would spend the rest of the war retreating toward its own borders. But its aftermath revealed a harsher truth. Victory did not bring mercy, and liberation did not guarantee freedom. The quiet front that had seemed so safe in June 1944 became the graveyard of German power in the east. And in Warsaw, the cost of that victory was written in ashes.